Hello YouTubers. This is the 10th video where we continue our series of developing enterprise level end-to-end Blazor applications using the server-side Blazor. In the last video we talked a little bit about binding and how we can bind UI controls to a particular hardly strongly typed model, and then make sure that this model is updated as soon as the UI controls are updated, and then we're sending that downstream to the API, where the API will handle all the validation and all that work that we talked about before. So today we are going to continue that journey, right? We put a lot of work and effort into making sure we are properly categorizing and handling the exceptions based on the kind of exceptions that we're getting out. So we talked about the categorization of exceptions. There's validation exception, there's dependency exception, there's service exception, and then there's a subset of our dependency exception, which is dependency validation exceptions, which we are treating them as validation exceptions, something that the user needs to take action based on. So you have two exceptions where the users are supposed to do something about them, and there are two other exceptions where it is the engineer's fault and the engineers are supposed to handle whatever is coming out of them. How do we go about doing something like that? Let's jump real quick into our code here. Let's go back to our code here and let's see what we're dealing with. So if I run my application, I'm just going to go ahead in here and just run my application. If I run my application today, and I don't post anything in my application, you will notice that, well, first of all, I'm not going to run my API, so our API is not working. And give me a second here. One moment. Let's just run this one more time. There you go. So remember that guy, we put in some information here and we said we're going to hit the API, and the API is going to go and try to handle and we had our own structural validation on the UI side where we try to make sure, you shouldn't be sending a request to the API before you validate that your data actually is in good shape, and your data is actually viable enough to communicate to the API out of it. Otherwise, you're opening up the door for malicious usage of your data and overconsumption of your API unnecessarily, right? So what's an example of this? If I just go and submit student like this, you will see this message in here: an unhandled exception has occurred. See browser dev tools for details. So if I go and click F12 on a Chrome, you can see an error in here. It says student view validation exception, and underneath it'll tell you the identity number is not in good format, and here's the value. The value here is empty. How do we go about handling that? How do we go about displaying that to the user? There are so many different ways you can display an error message to the end user. There are formats where some people decide to use a toast, what they call a toast, which is a little box that pops on the left side in here that says, hey, this is not the right information. I'm not getting the right data out of this. Some people go and say, no, in a form situation, I want to go and say the right under the student identity, I want to say that this text box is not in the right shape and the right format. Some people go and say, well, no, we don't want to do it this way. We want to just display the message at the end here that says these particular errors have occurred. There are so many different ways that you can communicate errors to the end user, and this is what we call UX, user experience, meaning that what kind of experience are you providing for your end user to help them fix any issues that are in their system, by simply just pointing out exactly where the error is or where the problem is. Today we're gonna try to handle this from an operational standpoint. We're not gonna, talk a little bit. We're not going to talk too much about, where to display the error. We're just going to put an error label in there and just say there's something wrong with the system. But later on, we're going to try to actually adjust to that in a way that is a little bit more readable for us and a little bit more easier to handle these errors and these exceptions. You know, there are so many good tools out there that actually allow you to actually, you know, highlight the field where the problem has occurred and actually go and say, okay, highlight this field is in bad shape. And there is a little bit of work that I'm doing these days around evolving our coding standard so we can actually provide even more details about why some particular fields are failing, which I'm going to follow up on a completely new series, which is called the standard, where I just basically discuss some architecture and high-level architecture issues and address the new standard that I'm actually putting together for all the engineers that I work with every day. So okay, so there's a problem here. There's an exception that's happening, and we want to tell the user something is wrong, right? Let's just start with something super simple in here and say, when an error occurs, I want to be able to handle that properly, right? So let's just go ahead in here and say, let's start with a test, just like everything else. I'm going to go to my components. Under views, I have my student registration component, I have render. I'm just going to create another one in here, another file in here, and I'm going to call it exceptions. Let me hide the camera here so you can see it's at the bottom of the, actually, let me first increase the font size so you are able to see all the good stuff. Here you go. So that's all the stuff that you need. There you go, right here. And here we go. All right, perfect. So now we have that. Now let's just go ahead and let's add a new file. I'm just going to copy this guy here. I'm just going to paste it down here. The only difference is that I'm going to call this, instead of render, I'm going to call it exceptions. Still on the fence about calling it exceptions or render, but I think it's fine. Overall, I think it's okay. So all right, so let's just zoom out a little bit so I can see the code. I hope you can see this. And let's go ahead and write that situation that we have in here. So we have a bunch of tests in here that we really don't need. So all of this we don't really need right here. And we also don't care about, you know, the text boxes and setting the values and all that kind of stuff. We also don't care about none of that, really. All of that we don't care about. But what we really care about is that what kind of exception we're going to throw and how we're going to handle that exception. What kind of message we're going to display in that situation. So let's just go ahead and clear out. I'm probably going to clear out the entire test and just start over. That would be much better than, you know, trying to clean up an existing test. Let's just go ahead in here and take away all of this. And let's do this. Should throw, should render inner exception message if validation error occurred. Async or occurred. So what does that mean? What I'm basically saying is if the exception that's coming from the one service that's talking to your UI component is a validation exception, we're going to actually show the inner exception message. We're going to actually show the message that's in the inner exception, not just the outside exception. And when we talked before about, you know, how that the dependency exceptions and the service exceptions, they have their own little high-level message, like saying something like error occurred, contact support, right? Error occurred, contact support. This is basically what we say when we really don't want the user to know what actually happened because it's mostly a server issue, data leak, you know, memory leakage, or an error in the configuration, whatever the case may be, versus an error where they didn't provide the right data points, and we want to basically help them see that. We want to help them see that this is not, you know, the proper way to enter that data. So let's just go ahead in here and say we have a given, we have a when, we have a then, and let's just go ahead in here and create an inner exception, inner validation exception. So let's go ahead in here and say inner validation exception, and it could be any exception really. So let's just go ahead and say exception like this. And I want a message, right? So this is inner exception, inner validation, or let's say, yeah, random message, get random string. So I just want to create a random string. Luckily, we have this cool library called dynamics, which will help us work through this. Static, and here's a string, get random string, and then new mnemonic string, like this, mnemonic string. And I think it has a bunch of really cool options like word count, word minimum length, or whatever. I don't care really. If you do, that's fine. If you're testing and you wanna make sure that things are, your UI can handle large text, that's fine. But for me, it doesn't really matter. So the large text doesn't really make any difference for me at this point. So let's go back to our exceptions. And here's my random text, and then here's another string, and this is validation message, which is a random message. And then let's take this guy and throw it right here. That's your exception message, and that's your inner exception. And that inner exception could be of any type. They all inherit from the exception class, main class, which is fine. This is particularly fine. And then let's go in here and say, well, I want to create the other exception, which is student registration view validation exception, which is new student registration view validation exception, because that's the exception that we expect to come out of that service. So let's go ahead in here, and I might have misspelled that one. Let's go back in here and see. So this is my model, student views, exceptions, and then there is student view. Oh, sorry, yeah, student view validation. Okay, student view validation exception. It's not student registration, that's for the component. So I do control period in here. And by the way, while I'm at it, just something that I noticed, a lot of people don't really know about. If you do control comma like this little diagram here, this little dialog here will pop up, and this dialog can search across your solution, across files, methods, classes, control comma, which is right next to your M letter. If you do that, I can literally search for anything. So if I'm trying to see what the name of something is, I could go and say student view validation exception like this, and it will go find me the name, where it's being used, and even navigate to it if I want to. And you don't even have to do it this way. You could just put the first letter. So student view validation exception. See, you're searching by the first letter everywhere. It's just a great capability that Visual Studio already has. I noticed that one of my friends the other day didn't really know about this, and I thought I'd share it with you. So okay, so we expect that when a call happens, something is going to happen here, and this is going to blow up because obviously it's going to throw that exception. We want to validate against that exception. So let's set up our mock in here to say that when the student view service mock is called, then the service dot register or add student async, it is any student. So we really don't care what's going to go in there because our focus here is just the student model. We just want to make sure that the student model itself is in good shape and in good format. So whatever goes in there, that's outside of the concern of this. A lot of people would go and say, no, we want to, fill in the fields and make sure that it generates the right model and that this model goes in. I'm like, dude, we already handled that in here. We already took care of that in this area here where we said, okay, I'm going to fill in the fields because that was the focus. And this is something very hard. I understand that for a lot of engineers, it's a little bit harder while you're developing to maintain focus on one particular path. It's a special skill set that you need to develop and invest in. But in general, you have to understand that every test should test one thing and one thing only. And if your test starts to branch out into multiple different passages and paths into your system, it's going to be very hard to maintain it. It's going to be very hard to understand it, and you will have absolutely no clue what the test is really meant to be, especially if the test starts getting longer and longer, and it takes a little bit of time. Normally, like my measure personally, when I say look at a test, if you can, obviously this is a zoomed in view, but normally my code looks like this. If I can have my test fit into that one view that tells me the entire story, that's good code right there. That's your measure right there. I can actually look at this and say, yeah, I can see this code. I can tell what it's doing, especially when you break it in sections like we're doing in here, like given and when and then, or some people say arrange, assert, and all that kind of stuff. It's good. Action, I think arrange, action, assert, something like that. So okay, so we have this guy in here. Excuse me. So we have add student view async, and I'm passing in whatever in there, and then after that I'm saying this guy is gonna throws async. I think I have way too many. Um, this is, oh yeah, that guy takes a student view. That's right. And this guy throws async. And what does this guy throw? The student view. Actually, this name is bad. Student view validation exception, just like this. So student view validation exception. All right, well, that's great. That's wonderful. So that means that we're going to handle this in a particular way. Now, how do we validate this? How do we know that when we hit the exception, something happened? If you remember a little bit back, we talked about, the different layers of issues and components. There is the loading state, there is the content state, and then there's the error state, right? But sometimes you don't really want the error state to completely change the view in your system. You don't want to lose the view. You just want to display an error message. So what do we do then? You can go back here and say, I want to set up a label in here. I'm going to call it the error label. It's all the way at the bottom here. I want to set up a label, and this label will basically tell me that something has changed in the system. I'm setting up the value of this label, and something has occurred. So how do we go about doing this? Well, if we need a label, then let's go back to our base components and create a label base. Don't just go and say, oh, well, that's easy. Let's just do this. Nah, don't do that, because that basically means that you're mixing native components in the system or external components with your customized components that you want to stay as is, even though you decide to change the UI from the back. So remember this. This is very important. Make sure abstraction, abstraction, abstraction. Try to keep away things that you don't have control over, external components, libraries, APIs, whatever the case may be. Hide them behind brokers and bases and all other abstraction layers so you are able to focus on the things that you can control and also be able to test it. So let's just go ahead and create a label-based component in here. So this is a razor component. And let's call this label base. So that's my label base. And my label base literally doesn't have much in it other than that it's a label. And inside that label, there's a value. That's it. There's no magic there. That's all that is. Later on, if I want to add things to it, I will. But for this particular purpose, that's all I care about. So in this label here, I'm just going to go and say I want some code behind that to be able to set stuff and get stuff from that label base. I'm just going to go here and say label base.razor.cs, razor.cs. And this guy is public partial. And let's just go ahead and say this is my file. And then I need a parameter. And under that parameter, I need a string value. So that's the value that I'm passing in. Maybe we also need a color, right? Maybe we need a color so we know that this label color is one thing or another. I don't know. We'll see what we can do here. And then we need a public method. Let's say set value. And it takes in a value. And obviously, the reason why we're doing this is because it's kind of frowned upon that you are setting components properties or parameters directly through the setters and getters. I mean, we may as well just make it a private setter. Sure, why wouldn't we do that? But anyway, I'm going in here and saying this value is set up this way. And I can obviously extract the value by just calling it. That's great. So I can set the value goes in, I can see the value being rendered on the component, and this is just a specific label. What that means is that I can go back to my student registration component in here, and I can define a new thing called public label base error label. Right? I try to put the name of the component, the type of that UI at the end, so you know that this is a UI component and know what to deal with it, especially when things start to look a little bit similar. So I have a label base, and in that label base, I want to go ahead real quick before doing anything else, and I want to write in my tests that I have this new component that I need to add to my system, which is initial student component dot label error label should be null before rendering, and then when it renders, it needs to be not null. Let's go all the way down here and say this dot rendered student component dot answer. See how easy that is? It's very, very easy. You're adding a new thing and you're test driving it like this. You're saying, okay, I'm going to add a new thing. Great, that's fine. Let's go and add these validations in here. And also at the end here, you also want to say this dot rendered, since this is a successful process, we want to go and say student view, no, actually label should still be the value in it should dot value should be what do we want to call it? Be empty or be null rather. So there is no value in it. Be null. Come on. There you go. All right. So a couple of these. This test should technically pass because this test basically is saying, do you have the right components in the right place? So let's run this one first and see how things go here. All right, so this one is good. This one is in good shape. But this one here will fail. That's for sure. Why? Because we didn't attach anything. We didn't really create a UI component that actually corresponds to that label. Let's see if that's the case. What did we say? Oh, be null. Oh, we need to say be not null. Be not null. Or not be null. Not be null. Like this. Yeah, let's try this again. This guy should fail. This guy is our validation, our strongly typed programmatically validating that we don't have a UI component that actually corresponds to this particular a label. So if you go in here, yeah, this guy is saying expected object not to be null. Great. Let's commit this as a failing. Let's only commit the ones we care about. So this is stage this. Let's just keep our history clean here. And let's stage this. And I want to stage the rendering part. And I'm going to go here and say, yeah, for this guy has failed. So I committed staged in here. And let's go and make this guy pass by simply going into my implementation and actually attaching the error label. So this is label base, ref. This is error label, like this. That's it. I'm not putting any values in there. Not doing anything yet. I'm just saying, oh, we can set values to it and stuff, and that's all. But I'm not really doing anything in it yet. So okay, so this is great. Now what do we do? What do we do? We want to go and actually run that test again, that failing test again, and make sure that our label is actually passing. Here we go. Still running, building and doing stuff, and the test is passing. So that basically verifies that you actually have an error label sitting out there. Obviously, if I run the application right now, it won't give us anything, simply because the value is just not null. We didn't. It's empty. We didn't really put anything in there. It might be useful if we put that test as well in there, just to make sure that this error label doesn't have any values in it. We don't want anyone to go in and sneak in some default values. So I'm just going to go ahead and say error label.value should be null. So the error value should be null. We know that for sure. And we didn't do that test in the previous. We didn't do the value check for nullability in the previous one, because if it is null itself, it will throw a null reference exception. We don't want to do that. What we really want to do, we want to go and say, okay, if the thing is null, then everything in it implicitly is not present and is not available. So if the main error label component itself is null, then there's absolutely nothing in there. And this one as well passed, which means that if someone tries to be smart and goes and says, oh, I'm just going to sneak in a value in here like this and say, ha ha ha, I have a value. If I go and write my test and actually run my test again, it will catch that. It will say, nope, you can't, on render time, at the initial rendering time, you can't actually add in a value in there. See, this guy is erroring out simply because it's saying that the string is supposed to be null, but you have, haha, I have a value, right? So that's more precise testing and something that is more reliable than just anything else. So let's just put this guy this way, and then I'm going to show you in a second what we're actually going to do with this error label. So we have these tests. We now have the test passing. That's great. Let's stage the stuff we care about, which is the render, and I have the render in here. Stage, and let's run it just one more time. It doesn't hurt. Just take the time and just run things one more time, just to make sure that before you commit and before you report something as pass, then that it really passes. I appreciate your strong belief in your code, but still run it one more time, even if you're 100,000% sure. If you're 99.9% sure, run it one more time so you are 100% sure. So this guy basically passed right here. Now let's go back to what we were doing. A little bit of diversion there, but here we are. We have this message in here, and this is my exception. And in here I'm saying, okay, it's going to throw this exception. And my expectation that this validation message is also expected error message. And that's my validation message. This is what I'm going to validate against at the end. So that means I can go up in here and say this dot rendered component dot render component student registration component, like this. There you go. So this is me rendering. Great. Now let's go ahead and click a button and make a scene out of it. So here you go. This is instance, and then button, submit button, and then click. So I'm clicking the button, right? And then my expectation is that this dot rendered component dot instance dot error label should be equivalent to, right, the expected error message. Expected error message. So that's the expectation. What else do we expect in there? We expect that we have called our mock service at least once. So verify exactly once, actually, not at least once, exactly once. So service dot add student sync with any student just one time, times once. And let's verify that there are no other calls that have happened on the system since then. That's it. That's all that it is. Actually, student view. I keep saying student view. I must have references that I don't need in here. Yes, I do. All right, so here it is. This is a test. Add student view. It is any student view, and basically we're saying that when an error occurs, this label is going to pop up the validation, the inner validation message of this system. Is that really the case? Let's find out. Let's run this guy. And our hypothesis is that this guy should obviously fail because the system doesn't really handle the error the way we expect it to. Here we go. Here we go. And test finished. And here's the error. It said expected subject to be system string, label base. It just crashed and burned all over the place. Right? So let's go ahead and commit this. So this fail like this. Great. And I think in this area, yeah, yeah. So this is perfect. Let's go back here. It's just a little the little warning that's bothering me a little bit. I'll come back to it and fix it. But this is how it's looking like. So now we're failing. Now let's go ahead and make our test actually pass. So the way how we go and do this, let's go into the student registration component. And in here, in this button click, let's do a little try catch. And we can't do try catch in this level because this is the final level. And there is no expected logic to happen in here other than the actual call that you're doing. So this is student view validation exception. Here's that guy. Let's get that guy here. Student view validation exception. Like this. And inside that guy, now we're going to go and say this dot error label dot set value or value equals that student. So let's get the message first. Validation message equals student view validation exception dot error exception dot message like this. So that's my message right here. And then I'm going to set that value to that message right here. So this is my validation message like this. That's it. For this particular case, that's okay. You know, I don't need to change the state because changing the state will change the entire component into something else, which is an interesting topic that we will talk about in a second. But in this particular case, I'm just going and saying, oh, set that error message out there based on that exception that you're receiving right here. So what are we going to do about this? Let's go back and run the test. And after we run the test, running the test is not enough. Still run it manually and see that it's actually working as you expect it to. So let's see if that works in here. This guy should pass. Hypothesis. Too long time though with the rendering. But let's see if this actually makes this pass. And okay, so it says test run finished. And we have a failing test. Why do we have a failing test? Let's see what the deal is. So, oh, because I was testing against the error label instead of its value. That's my bad. Let's go and run this guy. That's my bad. I can append to the previous failing test, but let's see if this one passes first. Yeah, this one is passing now. So let's append this. I want to append this to the previous message. So this exception guy, I'm just going to go and say stage this guy first, and then append, or sorry, amend to the previous previous commit. So this way I'm basically saying, oh, just amend that, which means that if I go and actually disable my work in here, I want to see it still fail first. So I'm just going to comment this guy real quick and go back to my test here like this, and I'm going to run this one more time. I want to see it fail. And then I'm going to commit it as passing test, and then we will actually run it and see how things actually work. Yeah, this guy's failing, saying I expected the value to be this random string, mnemonic string, whatever that is, and I actually found null. Great, that makes me very happy. So that means if I set that guy back, I will have a passing test. So let's run this guy real quick in here. There you go. So this guy is passing. That's wonderful. That makes me very happy. So I can go here and say that guy pass. So is that really the case? I don't know. Let's run our code and let's see. I'm giving you a theory. I'm telling you, well, things make sense. Things look like that. But does that mean if I actually submit student in here, do I actually get a message? It looks like it did handle the exception, but I don't see the message in here. I wonder why is that? it's very possible that you still need to refresh the view on the broker side, on the base component side, to make sure that this actually works. Let's try it. Let's just give it a shot. See, like I said, you have to run things and make sure that things actually look the way they present themselves to be. So if I go here and say, well, set the value and refresh state, would that work? Let's find out. State has changed. So this is a little refresh thing that you do to make sure that things are actually working for you when you change the state. Let's see if that's the case. Here we go. If I submit this, there you go. Invalid student view error occurred, parameter name, identity number, parameter value, null. So you have invalid student view, and here's the error message that you're presented with. Obviously, we're gonna do a lot more than just displaying it this way. We're gonna use the data in the exception and actually map that data into these particular controls. So when an error happens, instead of it showing like this, we want it to actually show right here and say this guy is in bad format and all that kind of stuff. So we just needed to refresh the view, and because this is on the base side, we don't really care. We don't care to test this. We just want to make sure that this is in good shape, in the sense that we're setting the right value in the right place, and we're saying that this is an invalid student view. Here's the problem. All right, that's perfect. Let's go and test the other exception, which is a dependency exception. A dependency exception is very important. This is when you go and say, oh, you have a bad request or you can't communicate with the database. This is a good time for us to go and create something. So in our exception here, we're handling student view validation exception, right? We're saying student view validation exception. But there's also student view dependency validation exception, where we want to treat it exactly the same as the student view validation exception. There's dependency exception, something underneath in downstream services that actually indicates that something else has failed. Maybe on the API side, maybe the API itself is throwing an exception if the student age is, over 100 or something like that. It doesn't make sense. That's a logical validation that's happening on the UI that you want to propagate all the way up to the UI. So how do I do that? There's this really cool thing that you can do in testing, which is basically being able to say private static whatchamacallit, view. Let me remember it. I have it here in multiple places. Let's see if I can look at the API here and actually get this out. What's the most recent thing we just created? The students, maybe semester courses tests. See, the team has built so many different things in the back here, which is amazing. So you can say IEnumerable, but there is a better way that you can actually do this. Give me a second. Let me find out if I can get this in here. Let's see. So this is I don't know, it just completely disappeared from my head. There is a better way you can do you basically passing in a collection of exceptions, and you want to say, okay, this collection of exceptions, we want to handle them in this particular way for all the validations or all the all the exceptions that match a particular case. We want to handle it in a particular way. So that is called, my friend here is called, let's see, the exceptions. There we go. This would be your theory data. Theory data. So that's the word I was looking for. Theory data, not this guy. So I want to go and say theory data. And this theory data, let's say this is student view validation exceptions. Exceptions because there's, many of them, multiple of them that we want to validate against. Okay, so this is where we want to go here and say, okay, I want to create two exceptions. This is return new theory data with exceptions. And this theory data is going to have two different things, right? So number one, I want to return new student view validation exception. That's number one. So that's one exception that I have. And then there is new student view dependency validation exception. If I pull one reference for one of them, I'm basically pulling the reference for the other. So here's my exceptions. And now I need my inner exception and the message, which basically means I could just go back here and copy that good stuff that I have all of that stuff in here. I can take that stuff out. And I'm going to show you what I'm going to do here. There is that inner exception messages and all that. And I could just go and say, put in that inner validation exception. And yeah, that looks quite good. So this is student view validation exceptions. Now I can go and turn this guy into a theory. And this theory basically will run multiple tests with different data point. So I can say this is a theory. This is member data, name of, and this is student view validation exceptions like this. So that basically says, oh, pass in this guy in here as an exception, and then in here I can go and say student view validation exception. So that basically takes care of this entire guy in here. I don't need none of that. And I think instead of member data, let's see, um, uh, what did we call it? It's not member data. It is, yeah, no, it should be member data. No, that's right. Maybe it's the static nature of, let's see what's airing out in here. This is member data must reference a public. Oh, okay. Perfect. Sorry about that. Here's a public member. And let's go back here and see this guy. Okay, perfect. So now I expect that, okay, so this guy here, okay, it's going to throw this guy. I expect that the expected message to be that student view validation exception dot inner exception dot message. So now that's my expected error message. If I run this, one test will pass and the other test will fail because the other one I didn't really handle, you know, the situation where I'm getting a dependency validation exception. So I'm going to show you in a second. Okay, so this is a dependency validation exception. See, it will tell you, oh, one of them passed. Let's see why it says both of them failed actually. Let's see why that happened. This is your expected error message. It's in your inner exception dot message. And you have the expected error message right here. We expect this to be in your error label. Let's see what the error that we're getting is. It's saying the current thread is not associated with a dispatcher invoke async. Ah, the problem with this is that we're doing a refresh when we do state has changed. And that's causing some issues. Let's try to do it this way. Instead of saying state has changed, let's say invoke async and then pass in state has changed in here. It's not going to affect anything on the performance aspect of things. Like, you know, when you're running your application in the real world, it's not really going to change that, but it will definitely has a huge impact when you're running your test. Let's just see if this actually makes it work, and then I'm going to run everything just one more time just to make sure that things are actually working as they're supposed to. And then I'll explain to you this in 1 second. Okay, there you go. So you have one passing, one test passing, and one test failing. Now that we're actually working like this, let's just validate that, you know, invoking async and saying the state has changed doesn't actually impact our validation rendering. There you go. So here's this is working. Okay, so this is a perfect situation then. So everything is abstracted away. Your tests are basically telling you, oh, I didn't really get the message, even though you said state has changed, because there's a different thread that's going off, and your test is only targeting one particular rendering thread. that's actually trying to display that message. You're just saying, I don't see that change that you're talking about, even though in the real world it's actually happening. Your test doesn't really confirm to that yet, which is a very deep topic, and I think we could do better, from a rendering standpoint. But let's just keep going and focusing on what actually works for us. So, okay, so I still have one failing test in here. Let me commit that test in here as fail. And let me go make it pass. So let's go down here into the component. And something very similar to that. The only difference here is that I'm going to take that catch block in here and put it right here. The only difference is that I'm going to go and say student view dependency validation exception, which is the other one. This is dependency. I hope we're not over 120 characters. Nope, we're good. And let's put that guy in here. Here's our test. Here's our message. Perfect. So now let's go back and run our test and make sure that it's actually passing. So let's go back here. Here's our test. Run this guy. And lo and behold, it's passing. So that means that whether it's a dependency validation exception or whether it's an exception in and of itself, we will still get that, error. That means if my API is running and for whatever reason we're going and saying if the overall number of years is not supposed to be 100 years for a student that's registering a particular school, let's say there's a minimum age that we need to have. It's very easy now to go and say, okay, that's a dependency validation exception, propagate that all the way from the API up to that component. Okay, so this guy is passing. Now let's handle the other error, which is things that you're not supposed to display to people, things that are very straightforward, things where you go and say, okay, an actual error has occurred, and that error has occurred because, there's some system failure. Go ahead and contact support. Let's write a test that's very similar to this one. It's very, very similar to this one. But how we're handling things is going to be a little bit different. So in here, I'm going to go and say should render exception message, not the inner exception message, but more like outer exception message, if dependency error, dependency or service error occurred. Now we need to change the set of errors. Now we want to go back in here and say I want one that's exactly like this. And in here I'm going to go and say student view dependency service exceptions. All right. I don't really care about the inner exception anymore. I'm just going to keep it there for because this guy requires an inner exception, but we really don't care about it. I can actually create an exception without a validation message. I can take out all of that stuff because it doesn't matter. And these guys already come in with their own built-in validation message, so that's great. Now all I really want to do here is to go and say that the inner validation message is in here, but I'm changing this validation into a dependency exception. That's one. And the other one is student view service exception. Did I write that wrong? Let's see. Dependency exception. There you go. So now this is dependency and service exceptions. In my exception here, I'm going to change there to say student view dependency service exceptions. Great. And I expect that the message will actually be the outer message. This is student view dependency service exception. It's just dependency or service, really. That's what I'm trying to say. And forgot to rename that guy. So that's this and this and this. And this guy should fail. And this guy is failing simply because, it can't handle that at the moment. If an error occurs for whatever reason, we really can't do anything with it. And I'm going to show you now what that looks like. Great. So if I run this now, both of these tests should fail because I'm not really handling this properly. So there you go. This is a failing test. Oh, I couldn't handle any of these. Great. Let's go down here and say this is a failure. This is a failing test. You want to make sure that you're actually throwing the right exceptions. It says I expected the string to be student view dependency error occurred contact support but found null. Let's go into our student component here and let's handle these two exceptions. So I'm going to go and take this guy in here and I'm going to go and say, oh, instead of validation exception, I want to put a dependency exception. And instead of a dependency validation exception, I want to put a service exception. And feel free to like put this and this into its own method and this into its own method. I leave it out like this for learning purposes, but if you want to do it the other way, that's also fine. Let's take the inner exception out of all of this. Let's call these values what it is. Here's lowercase s because it's a variable name. And this also is a lowercase s because it's a variable name, like this. All right, so this is all great. That means I'm handling all the possible exceptions that may happen outside of this particular API call. And you may abstract that away if you want. This is the equivalent of a controller. Like if you look on the API side, you know, you basically go into your controllers and you basically say, you know, hash out in there, just put out there all the exceptions that you want to have because this is the last point of contact before you actually exit the system. So it doesn't really matter at this point in time if you're trying to abstract this away because you only have a handful of things to do on one component. If you have way too many things in one component to do, then I would question, you know, the ideas of separation of concern and all that kind of stuff. But other than that, you know, let's shorten this guy out. This guy is really annoying. It's too large. Dependency validation exceptions, just call it that. That would work out. Okay, so this guy is like this, and we already handled it. Let's go into our tests and see if we can have our test pass. It's very, very test-driven, straightforward process. There you go. So that guy says, yep, I can handle this. It's working properly. Pass. Great. Is that really what it is in the real world? Let's find out. It's very easy to find a dependency exception because I'm not really running the API in the backend. So it's going to be very easy to go and say, okay, I'm going to fill in the identity of the student. But I'm going to go and submit. Because there is no API, I expect to get an error message about, oh, I couldn't really contact the API. There you go. Student view dependency error occurred. Contact support. So what does that mean? It's basically saying the API is failing, but you don't want to tell your end user that this actually what happened, right? What you want to tell the end user is that there is a problem in the system and we're taking care of it. That's it. Everything else is not necessary, is not needed, right? Now, the messaging around these exceptions is what we're evolving our coding standard to do. And this is what I'm going to talk about in our next sessions when we talk about actually beautifying all of this and actually mapping particular errors to particular controls if the time allows. But this is a completely functional registration system for a student. You can actually fill in the data, do a selection like we showed last time, but now when an error occurs, I can display that little bar in there that says, okay, this is actually how this guy is supposed to look like. It would be nice if we go and say, I want to control the error message that pops up. Let's let, for instance, I want to make it, you know, I want to make the color of it red, for instance, right? Because our base label is too generic, you know, it's not really doing much with the input. So we can go and actually change that in a test-driven fashion by simply going and saying, oh, I want to, in my models here, I can go in here and say, I want to create a new model. And this model will be label bases. All right, because that's a model that you could just say colors because you're going to be using it in a lot of things. And let's just go here and say class. color. This is a color enum. And in that enum, let's put just the color red. Just red. Because that's all you need at the moment. Maybe default to black if you want to. That's fine too. Let's say black. That's your default. And then if you want to have other options, that would be it. Let's go and play with our label base in here. And let's have a new parameter. And this new parameter will be string, not string now, color. And this is the color. Oh, not the drawing. We want the one that we created. And this is color. Here's a getter and a setter. Great. We want to allow this color to change the actual look and feel of the system. You can do anything with that. You can go in here and say, well, you know, I can go and say, you know, style, and I think it's font, color, or is it just color? Color equals, and then you can put the color value in here. And it should technically understand what you're trying to do. Right? Is that really the case? I don't know. Let's find out. So if I, you know, if I go and set the value of this guy just for POC, if I go and set the value of this color to red by default, and yes, you can do this in C#, you know, while you're instantiating an object, this actually give me a red color. Let's see. Click this guy. Yeah, see, you have a red color in here just by simply, but that's not good enough. We want to be able to set the color value in there. I'm going to take this guy out. I'm going to go write a test in here that says the default value for the color in the error label, because it's very specific to errors, is supposed to be red. So where do I put that? Yeah, I verified that the value here should be null, but I also want to go and say this.rendered student component.instance.error label, which is not null, but the color of it should be, here you go. Oh, wrong buttons. Let's go here and say color dot color for models. It should be red. So I want to make sure that the value in there is red on an instantiation time as default value. This guy should fail. See, that's test driven in here. I'm basically saying the default value, or the value that should be for this label, should be red. I didn't touch anything else. I'm just saying this should be in this particular format. So obviously this guy's going to come here and say, well, I expected the color to be red, but it was black. Okay, now we're talking. So now I can go into my component. Let's just match this. Let's just mark this as fail. Just like this. And I can go back into my component, my student registration component, and I could go and say color, set the color on this in here on the fly. Color should be red. And let's take these values out here, and that's me just basically saying, yeah, you know, from a UI perspective, programmatically, I'm telling you, this is how this is going to look like. So this is OSSS models, yeah, something like that. All right, does that really work? Is that really the case? I don't know. Let's run the test and let's find out. And after we run the test, we're going to run everything end to end and see if that's actually the case. So let's see, this is my exceptions, sorry, my render. I'm going to run this guy here. Oh, I missed something. Let's see, what did I miss? Oh, web.models. Yep, my bad. Let's do it this way. Models.colors. Yeah, perfect. Let's go back to our tests. And the rendering. And let's run this guy again. So technically that guy should pass. Perfect. See? So that guy is passing. Great. It's passing. I want to see it. I want to see it with my own eyes. I want to know that it's actually passing. Let's do this. Let's go and say, okay, I'm going to fill in the right information. And here is, I don't know, some date. And let's go and submit. This guy will try to contact the API. Should give me something in red. Beautiful. Student view, dependency error occurred, contact support. You see what's going on? So that's basically, that's basically what's happening. Now, like I said before, the messaging here needs to change, right? And that's what we're evolving our standard to do, right? What this should really say is something like system error occurred, contact support. And for the error messaging, I shouldn't tell you student view. I shouldn't tell you anything about that. I should just tell you, this input is failing and you need to fix it. The parameter name is this and the value is this. Validation error occurred, name is this and name is that. And that's something we're going to evolve into our standard as we go. But that's basically the end result. See how things are coming all the way upstream through, if you're using RESTful Sense, if you're using the right libraries, you can actually propagate all these errors all the way up to the end result. What's actually happening in here is that it's basically telling you that the API, we can't communicate with the API. But as an end user, you really don't care about that, right? You really don't care about that. So that's great. So that means that's a fully developed area where we are handling the exception, rendering the exceptions into our system. In the next video, we're going to be talking about, let me first commit this one, and then I'm going to tell you what we're going to do in the next video. So this guy here is passing, like this. And I'm going to push all that stuff to source control. All right. So in this video, we basically talked a little bit about, okay, there are exceptions are happening, and because we categorized our exceptions, now it's so easy for us to identify whether these exceptions are the user fault or is the system fault. There's nothing else in between, right? You could actually do, if it's a validation error, you're telling the user exactly what exactly happened, so you can deal with it, or you can go and say, no, it's actually a system error. We're not going to tell you the details. We're not going to give you the inner exception message. We're not going to tell you the actual issues that happened in our system, but we're going to tell you, hey, reach out to support. Something is wrong. You need to try this again, or whatever the case may be. I hope that this was informative to you. I hope that you could use this and actually be able to see. Now you can visualize the happy path. We took care of the happy path in the previous video where we posted a student, went all the way to the API and came back. But now we're handling all of these edge cases. There's something wrong with your input, but there's something wrong with the configuration in the API. Are we actually logging the right messages? So when you're returning an exception through the form and you're saying, oh, there's a dependency error, the engineers are already receiving a critical error that says, oh, the API configuration is failing. You need to go ahead and try to fix the API configuration. People are not able to connect to your API and actually post information to your API, which is great. We say contact support because at the off chance that somehow, somewhere in the world, your paging mechanism or your logging is not actually sending you the right message, you're actually leveraging your existing users, on the system to actually reach out to you and say, oh, by the way, I couldn't access the system, something is wrong, especially with critical issues, users telling you, just in case, this is part of engineering process, you want to think about all the possibilities. You can communicate properly to your end users, but you could actually leverage them as also a way. It's not a good way. You're supposed to know that your system is down before your users know about it. The fact that your user is reaching out to you and telling you something is wrong with your system, that's not a good thing. But you still want to have that covered up just in case your backend alerting and monitoring mechanisms are not doing their job for whatever reason. Let's say you have a catastrophic issue and the system is down and it's impacting your app insights or whatever logging system you're using to alert your engineers about the system failures. You still want to go and say, okay, contact support. Maybe you want to put a link in there, right? And say, okay, click here on contact support and let it send an email or whatever the case may be. So that's pretty much it. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please free to reach out, and drop a comment in the comment section. Reach out to me in whatever social media platform you'd like to use. And there will be a little bit more to handling exceptions. There will be a little bit more to rendering errors. This is just me scratching the surface and giving you just a tiny bit of an idea about, how you can actually render these exceptions, how you can communicate that to end users. I appreciate your feedback, for all the feedback that people put in the comment section, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching. See you in another video.